When it comes to self-development, no matter the method you use, the vital point is to practice. If you're ready to transform your life and claim the potential inside of you, you're in the right place. Welcome back to The Vital Point. I'm your host, Jonathan Schechter. As a transformation coach and breathwork facilitator, I'm invested in making the dynamic landscape of personal evolution accessible. My goal is to inspire you to take action for yourself. You have the capacity to evolve and bring your intentions and dreams into the world, and there's never been more access to so many incredible modalities that can help you on your journey. This podcast will help you learn simple methods you can use to transform your life and share the stories of practitioners who are doing the work so that you feel inspired to go and practice, because that's the vital point. And I have a heck of an episode for you today. My guest is Otto Maier, who is a psychedelic integration guide, IFS therapist, Jungian coach, and ritual facilitator for retreat centers around the world, including Tandava retreats. The main focus of his work is in helping people in the Western world embody transcendent experiences through the vehicle of decolonizing the psyche and learning how to listen to the ancient language of our souls. Oftentimes, I go through these periods where I'm recording a lot of podcasts, and then there's a gap in the time between the recording and the editing and publishing part of the process, right? And sometimes it's very illuminating to go back and listen to that conversation again, because I'm listening to it as an observer. I'm also remembering and reliving certain things that I was going through during the recording experience. And oftentimes I'm remembering the joy or the high points of the episode. And this is one of those. I had such an amazing experience going back and re-listening to this podcast. Things that, through no fault of anyone, time had just passed and I had forgotten some of the details and the nuance of this podcast experience. And I also remembered the feeling of awe and sort of wow that I felt during the conversation. And so being able to get that warm, fuzzy feeling again was fantastic. Otto continues the theme of the season that all the guests on this season were folks that I met at the Psychedelic Science MAPS conference in Denver earlier this year. Literally, that's how we met. I was networking for my podcast. I went to talk with Joel from Tandava and started giving him my elevator pitch for what the podcast is about. And as soon as I said integration, he said, "Oh, you should have Otto on. He's our integration director." And I got so much more from this episode. I've really felt that I received so much from this conversation that I didn't expect. I was expecting to have a conversation about 5-MeO DMT and maybe share a little bit about my 5-MeO DMT experience, and also be able to get into talking about a psychedelic that is not the most accessible. It's not necessarily the one that most people start with, and is on another level. I'm just going to say that, even though it's subjective. I really liked, there's something in the episode that Otto mentions. He says something like, the human experience is a horizontal axis and the 5-MeO experience is a vertical axis. And I thought that that really encapsulated my experiences with this medicine. But it was such a richer, more deep, like a deeper, more rich experience than what I expected. I mean, from the get-go. And I hope that you appreciate that I am moving away from the sort of predictable, like getting to know you questions, like how'd you get involved in psychedelics, or, just, how did you find this path? I really want to get into sort of the juice of the conversation. And this is an example of that. We started to talk before I hit record. We got over the sort of small talk, ice breaking, getting to know you. How'd you get involved in this work? And then it started to get juicy. And it got to the point where I'm like, okay, I got to hit record because now we're missing out on really good stuff. And so the episode like starts mid conversation. And quite frankly, I think it's amazing because like within the first minute of the show, we're talking about the similarities and differences in internal family systems and somatic experiencing. And, the parts of ourselves that we've had to work with in order to support the integration for other people and holding space for others. We go into Otto's daily routines and practices and why meditation is a non-negotiable for him. And I also agree with that. He gives us some amazing book recommendations, which I would definitely recommend checking out. And then we get into this really cool space on a topic that I am learning to be more curious about, and just having to shut up and really listen because I don't know that much about it. And that's not always the experience that I have on the podcast. And that topic is the work of Carl Jung and archetypal psychology, archetypal energy within the psychedelic experience. And then finally into talking about 5-MeO, talking about preparation and integration, and the value of working with someone to support your integration experience. So overall, I am thrilled to bring you this episode. I know that you are going to enjoy it because I enjoyed it. And I'm really, really grateful to be in this place where I have a platform to meet so many incredible people and learn from them and listen to their stories, listen to their wisdom and experience. And I really walked away from this with that feeling, and then listening back to it to get this ready for posting was somewhat reliving that experience. And so I'm just super, super grateful to be in this position, to be able to share this with you. And I appreciate you supporting the podcast and giving me the opportunity to share with you. Whether you're new to the podcast or you've been following me for a while and you're nodding your head saying, yeah, I agree. I'm super grateful for these conversations and the value of them and the opportunity to listen to the experience and wisdom of these amazing guests. Then I would really appreciate if you could do something for me. It will only take a few seconds. It's not going to cost you anything, but that's to take a moment and leave a review for the podcast on Apple, leave a review on Spotify, or if you're following the channel on YouTube, go ahead and subscribe, leave a comment. All of these little simple methods, if you did all of them, I love you. Thank you so much. Even one of them would be very, very helpful. But it's a simple way that you can support the show and help more people discover it, because the fact is that this is how the algorithm works, right? And I want to continue to grow the show. I want to continue to keep bringing you amazing guests. And the more people that are following, that are leaving reviews, the more opportunity this is to get in front of people that would benefit and have value in the show. So thank you in advance for doing that. And now, without further ado, my conversation with Otto Maier. All right, Otto Maier, welcome to the Vital Point podcast.
Thanks for having me, man.
We got to a point where we were like, it was almost like I was itching to hit record because we were starting to get into some really juicy content.
That's right.
And I'm like, man, this is great for the podcast. So yeah, just to sort of pick up where we were talking, we found a really interesting place between somatic experiencing and internal family systems. And I was just sharing how excited I was that you to learn that you were doing IFS, and that you were interested in doing an IFS practice on the show. So yeah, can we maybe just drop back into that, the intersection of somatic experiencing and internal family systems, and what that means to you?
Yeah, um, I think IFS and somatic experiencing, my experience has been that they need each other. So
Mm.
IFS has a um, certain qualities and questions that can illuminate or shed light on maybe even visual components of our internal experience. And the somatic experiencing has such a slow wisdom that really gets into like the qualitative little nuanced details of a moment that we would just, or a feeling or something we would just overlook and go to the next movement. And I feel that I mean, trauma informed, I think is a really, well, obviously is a very popular term, but SE and IFS I find have the most practical frameworks for how to approach that trauma informed space, but they do it in such a graceful, simple, smooth way that I think they really, SC and IFS are almost the same thing, approached from, one is coming top down, the other's going bottom up. They use certain different languages, like I know an SC, uncoupling or overcoupled. Coupling is a word that's used a lot. IFS, it's blended, unblending. I like the word braided. Braided's my favorite. Like, oh, it sounds like these two things are braided here. Like, how does that feel? Sensory wise. And yeah, I think I would love to see a training where they like coexist together, because I personally find that when I'm in an experience with a client, I find that they end up weaving together seamlessly. And there isn't this like hard moment where I'm like, oh, now we're doing IFS or now we're doing SE. It's like, um, yeah, they really kind of nurture each other, I find.
Hmm. I agree 100%. Yeah. And there is something interesting that I've been going through with the somatic experiencing training itself, where sometimes I ask those questions of sort of integrating other modalities, like whether it's mind, like there's been so much in the last training I went to about the practice of orientation, right? Of really just allowing yourself to get curious about how you feel about your external environment so that you can feel safe to go inward and explore what's going on inside. And as they're sitting there explaining this and going through it and talking about it, I'm like, this sounds like mindfulness. And as soon as I like raised my hand and said, so tell me about this, because this is what's coming up for me, there was this almost like this rigidity of like, well, hold on a second. There's a lot of overlap, but just we have to be really careful, and it's not exactly the same. And I get it, like you're in a training, you're representing a particular sort of product, right?
Mm-hmm.
And modality. And so people have some rigidity around that, and I get that. But what I find out in the field is more of what you just described, of practitioners that are blending different, modalities, because there is so much overlap, because they
Yeah,
are pretty much the same. We're just using different language to describe maybe the ineffable, right? Like
totally.
it's the words that we use don't matter as much as what we're really getting at the core.
Yeah. I'm really glad that you said that. I found the same thing, and I find this like funny attitude sometimes in, I would call it like therapy subculture, which is that like whenever there's a modality that works, there's a attitude of like guys, we figured it out. We just got to get into the body. Or like, guys, this is the Holy Grail IFS. It's just, we got to unburden these like protectors or whatever it is. But yeah, I've seen the same thing. I remember reading through some of the SE literature and being like, this sounds a lot like Tara Brach. It sounds a lot like mindfulness-based curiosity, So I do think that there's a lot of overlap. I do think that people have been exploring healing and self-awareness for a very long time. And I think we're bound to come across the same notions, ideas, and rehash them and make them new again. And yeah, I just like the humility of like, yeah, maybe we haven't found the Holy Grail. Maybe we've just rediscovered something that has been around for a long time,
Yeah, definitely. Well, what came up for me as you were sharing that was this experience I'm having currently with brain spotting, and like really being curious about that, and just having a very cursory understanding of it, but also having had an experience as sort of a client with it, and having that exact thought of like, oh, this is the answer. This is what's missing in my toolkit. Like if I could just go do this training, it's going to like enrich what I'm doing so much. And really picking up on this, like when I'm working with clients, watching when they start to track into the same place. They'll be talking to me like this, and all of a sudden they start talking about something traumatic, and like their eyes go to the same place. And I'm like, oh, this is that brain spotting thing. Like, I wish I knew how to explore this more, and still like kind of working with it through the lens that I'm looking at, right? Of like, okay, well, what do you notice in your body, like as you're bringing this up? But sometimes people are so disconnected from that, like I'll say, well, what do you feel? Oh, hold on a second. What do you feel right now? And they'll say, oh, I feel something. Okay, where do you feel that? In my body.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, like, can we, so it's like there's such a disconnect. It's such a foreign sort of language sometimes. It's great to talk to somebody like you. We can like get into the nuances of the somatic experience. There's so many people that are just disconnected from that, and there's just there's an awareness, I think, that builds, just like mindfulness. We can watch the breath. We can start to observe how the thoughts and the sensations move from the neck up. But are we also like including the body in that?
Mm-hmm.
And it's something that grows, right? I can't sit down with somebody and say like, I'm going to give you 10 years of meditation experience today. Like your experience is your experience, and it's going to continue to develop and grow based on, your practice and the experiences that you're having.
Mm.
So yeah, it's just, I find myself working a lot with people that are at a very, very beginning of that exploration,
Yeah.
and seem kind of cut off from the body.
Totally. I think I do want to push back on that just a little bit, because I think,
Yeah.
I think you can give someone in a one-on-one conversation the taste or experience of 10 years of mindfulness practice. Not all the time, but I do think that experience is available for folks. I do agree. I think that to make the large leap from I have practiced to some degree desensitizing myself from my body and from the signals it's giving me to survive, to, hey, focus in on your sensation, can be such a big leap sometimes. And I notice I talk to other friends who are somatic therapists, and they're like, man, sometimes it is a lot to get someone to keep focusing, to track, to continue to follow the
Right.
thread of their sensations. And I think that's why where IFS sometimes can be a great starting place, because it starts with narrative and story, which can weave into the body and the somatic experience. And people are so much more familiar with narrative, and thinking mind, to start from the top, what's familiar, to go back in, but to get back to the 10 years of meditation and like actually giving someone a taste of that experience. I really love Carl Rogers' work. And I find that, if we have to bring more IFS into the conversation, I think if I'm talking to you and I have an agenda to, I don't know, show you, bring you into your body, maybe, even if that's well intended, there's an agenda. So I'm energetically making a certain movement towards that agenda. I have found that if I'm coming into a conversation with someone with no agenda, I'm totally opening and I'm listening, even on my own sort of like mindfulness journey. I'm not attaching to what's happening, but truly being present and attuned to the person in front of me. I do think that invites somebody into that experience, even subconsciously. And I find that folks can get like a contact high, you can call it, of mindfulness, if you are being fully not in an agenda place. And I have a theory that I think that when Ram Dass talks about his guru, I'm like, that I feel like that's the contact high that everyone was getting, is like this guy who's so embodied in that present moment awareness that everyone around him is like, I'm just feeling this like unconditional love from this guy, and this guy's just being, he doesn't have this agenda to give everybody this love. He's just being, so I try to practice.
Yeah.
I try to offer that in my practice too, because I find sometimes if people are really struggling to be present, I'm like, well, if I am then trying to get them to be present, now I have an agenda. Now I'm not, but if I can sit back and really be with them in the discomfort of even wanting to tell a story or whatever it is, I think that opens up this a somatic experience vicariously.
So what are some things that you do to help bring you into that space so that you can be there with them?
I would say, well, for definitely taking care of myself. So I have like a pretty elaborate morning ritual that I think I need definitely to do the work that I'm doing. And I think it's like a sharp awareness of my parts. So for me, as like space holder or therapist guy, I have parts that are like wants to do good job part, who like really wants to make it work, part that's very afraid of not doing a good job, right? And then there's like other agendaed parts, like maybe I really want to use this one tool today, like, or maybe I really don't want to use, like sometimes IFS gets boring to me and I'm like, I want to do something else, right? So I think to bring in that, I would say like transpersonal level listening, I think for me, it takes an awareness of all the parts that I'm bringing to the space that are present, and being able to name them, notice when they come up, and have an attuned relationship with myself to a degree where I can ask them, I can be like, oh, I see you. Cool. And today we're going to just like let that go. It's okay. We don't have to do a good job. It's okay. Like, oh, we're not like going to use that tool. That's fine, and let those go and just create this it just creates this opening where I think so much more magic can happen in a conversation, whether it's therapeutic or just even if it's with a friend, you know, to drop into that level of listening, I think is, I think that's changed my life and my clients more than any of the modalities, I would say.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. I'm curious if you wanted to say more about your morning routine.
I can if you want. What do you want to know?
Sure. Yeah, just take us through it. What does that look like for you?
Well, I would say wake up. I right off the bat drink some water. I get up, make my bed, clean my room. I try to immediately get in my body. So I usually go for like a quick run. And then this is if I'm on my game. Clearly don't do this all the time, but if I'm on my game, I'm going for a run, I'm taking a cold shower, and then I'm doing meditation with a cup of coffee, and then I'm doing a writing practice, and then prayer, and that's about it, I would say. I would say on bad days, no matter what, I have to meditate. That is like the bread and butter. If I don't meditate, I don't know how people going through life without meditation. It's not like, hey guys, you should meditate. I'm like,
Right.
I don't know what you're doing, but like I could not survive without it. And then I would say writing and meditation, no matter what, those always get done. Those are definitely what keep me sane, I would say. And also like, I don't know, I just tend to be quite an emotional human being, and I need space to process my emotions, or else they just bubble over.
When you're writing, is it like a kind of a free form, or do you work with prompts? Like, is it a little bit of both?
It depends. I would say I'm really into the artist's way, Julie Cameron's work. I'm a poet, a writer. So I think I like doing morning pages, which is her practice of just like, you're going to write and you're not going to get in the way of making sense or trying to make it anything it's not. You're not even going to read it. Just one page, and you're just going to like anything that's coming out of you, just like meditation, you're just kind of allowing these things to like flow. So I'll usually do that. And then from that, then I might I might do some like IFS. I might write a poem. I might, I might get into like more of my creative writing, but I have to do that morning page stream of consciousness, just kind of like getting it out. For me, that helps me get really clear. It also helps me listen to myself a little bit deeper also.
Nice. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. The artist way has been pretty influential to me as well. I bought this big like 3-volume version because I guess she has more than one book. And I've only gone through the first one. But I keep looking at it and like, okay, we're coming back around. It's coming up. I can feel it.
Yeah.
So, and I really enjoyed that morning pages practice as well when I was going through it. Yeah, meditation is just a non-negotiable.
No, for real.
I agree with you. Like, I'm like, I start to fall apart. I can literally notice my brain getting squirrelier and more reactive and just less grounded and centered, and more reactive, I think is a great way to describe it. And just like what you were saying, when you're sitting with a client and you're able to have the awareness of these different parts and their needs and be able to communicate and stay in self, and present. That's what I start to notice starts to slip for me when the meditation isn't there.
Yeah.
You know, all of a sudden, like I start to lose that observer, and like being able to observe and keep that witness of all these different parts coming up, all these different needs and insecurities, or, you know, nuances of these different parts. And then boom, like something, you know, I react to something and we're just off to the races. So yeah, meditation, definitely non-negotiable.
Dude, you're like, this awareness slips away. My whole life slips away if I'm not meditating. I'm like just running on autopilot. I feel like I'm just like putting my life on autopilot if I'm not meditating.
Yeah. The other thing that came up for me as you were sharing was like, this thing I've been noticing doing the podcast is there's sometimes when I go back and I listen to the podcast, or like I'm editing an episode that, you know, I've already recorded, and I'm listening, I'm observing these two people, even though one of them is me having a conversation.
Right.
And there's like there'll be these sort of signpost moments, or like forks in the road, where listening back to it, I'm like, oh, that was so interesting. I should have followed up on that, or I should have like probed more about that particular point. But I'm also sort of reliving the experience that I had. And sometimes I'm like, oh, see, I didn't ask that because I had an agenda there. There was a particular thought in mind that I was holding on to, that I wanted to keep exploring or like go deeper with, or maybe I did even have like an agenda, like this is where I want to lead the conversation. And so I just let this great opportunity that came up organically in the conversation pass, because I wanted to do my thing. I wanted to go with my agenda.
Yeah.
And so just, you know, just noticing that and like holding myself accountable, I
Totally.
guess.
I'm so glad you brought that up too. Like brings up so much for me is like, I mean, I love Jungian psychology. I love James Hillman, all his work and all this kind of stuff. And it's really got a lot of passion for me is, and there's this book I'm like obsessed with. I've like read it like 3 times. It's called we've had 100 years of psychotherapy and the world's getting worse. And it's this, the book is a conversation between this journalist and this, my favorite psychologist, James Hillman. And they're so witty and they're like sharp and they're just kind of like going back and forth and riffing about different notions in psychology. And he talks about how like this idea that he's like, there's me and then there's you and then there's the conversation. And we're here, what we're here for is not for me. We're not here for me, or we're not here for you. We're here for the conversation. So that the conversation itself has its own energy, its own life force. Like there's this thing that's happening between us, you know. And they say the same can be said for therapy, that there's a dynamism that happens when a therapist and a client meets, and it's the third entity that is what's important. And we can totally get in the way of that third thing all the time if we have an agenda, if we're not listening, if we're, you know. And I think there is something like spontaneous and hermetic about that third element, because it's just like you got to be ready to like catch it as it's coming. And it's tough because you have to also be willing to let something go. I can tell you how many times I'm like talking to someone, I'm like, oh, that reminds me of, and they're still in the middle of something. And I'm like, I have to let this go because I'm just going to tune out from what they're saying. You know, if I'm not, if I'm like held on to like, I really want to talk about this thing, you know. And like, I love, Hillman always talks in terms of mythology, and that would be like the realm of Hermes. I think Hermes will inspire and bring an idea, but he'll take it away as quick as he'll give it to you. So you got to be willing to like play his game a little bit.
Totally. Yeah, there's times where like I'll make a note as somebody's talking, and by the time there's a pause, it just doesn't make sense to even come back to it.
Right.
Like the conversation's already gone.
Exactly.
It's moved in this other direction completely. And yeah, so besides from listening, what else fosters that attention and catching that third element?
I would say animism. I'll bring animism into the space, and enthusiasm. So like I would say that there's like an aliveness, right? Like you were just saying, there's these moments where something will come to you, right? So that's animism. Something is coming to you and it's leaving. So this thing has its own accord, right? So like we can use science language to describe it. I like to think more in terms of relation and animism because for me it creates more relationship that's exciting. So I would say what helps me be present is trying to be perceptive to what is sparking a flame in me of curiosity or new idea. And what I'm noticing in this other person, maybe it's a micro expression that just like lights up. And I just had a session with a client. And she's like talking about something, and then she goes like this. She goes like this and does this thing. And I'm like, she always does that. And I'm like, and she like does this thing, and it just I had this like image of this 7-year-old girl who didn't want to talk. And I just like it was so exciting to have that instead of me trying to be like trying to plug in IFS or whatever. I just remember being like seeing that, and I was like, hold on, like how old do you feel right now when you do this? When you like when you feel into like your arms and you go like this, how old do you feel? She was like 7. I was like, okay. And then it like sparked this. And for me, that was a moment that was not guided by me, that was guided by the aliveness of what was just in the room, right? And I would say what helps me get there is just the reward of how exciting that is when you've grabbed it. Like when you're like, oh no, we've touched the thing that's alive in the room between us. And that's like it's alivening. It totally is.
Totally. And I'm just kind of receiving that, just kind of taking it in, and I feel like you're speaking to something that is still very new to me. Like almost what's coming up for me is just like this, like being in this, like walking into this mansion, like a really large house, and just exploring. Um, and having these moments where, you know, like maybe you come into another room or you come around a corner and you realize, oh, wow, there's so much more space here. There's so much more than I thought there was. Um, and just the wonder of that and being willing to like be humble and open and just curious to continue to explore. So what attracted you to Hillman's work initially? Like what got you excited about him?
I would say that same aliveness, you know, you can call it like life force or the muse, whatever. I don't, you know, that moment in the conversation where there's something alive in the room with you. I feel that like we were talking about before we started the podcast, just you know, you had said that like a lot of your personal work led you to, you know, studying things that end up, you know, helping other people. I feel a lot of the stuff I've learned is just me trying to be like, I'm struggling and I need some answers, right? And
Mm-hmm.
very early on in my path, Jung's work really just sparked this this feeling in me that was very very satisfying. It was really satisfying. I would say my like a deep need and desire for, I would say, a mix of philosophy, psychology, art, literature, story, and mysticism all kind of wrapped in one. And I would say what attracts me to Hillman's work is this like very alive, artistic, creative, soulful perspective on phenomenon like anxiety, for example. And he makes it into something animistic, something alive that has a soul and a story and a context, and you can bring literature into it and art and all this kind of stuff that makes it alive and human, where just straight psychology bores me. It's like very boring and dry and really, to me, reductive. It like reduces the soulful, human, qualitative, somatic element, where the Jungian or the archetypal, all that stuff is rooted in the body. These are like rooted experiences, right? So instead of trying to like quell the anxiety, Hillman's like, who is the anxiety? And like, is the anxiety, has this anxiety been with you your whole life? Is it watching you? Is it pushing you? Is it choking you? Like, let's get to the qualities, and that like opens this curious space. And for me, I think what attracted me is just how much more creative and alive and deeply non-pathologizing it is, which for me opens up that image, to bring it back, of that mansion of life. There's so much more room for, well, maybe the house I'm living in is a lot bigger and a lot more cool than I actually thought it was, instead of being like, I have anxiety and like I deal with social anxiety or whatever. Hillman's more like, what is this beast of anxiety doing in your home? You know, and it like creates this whole imaginative space that is much more, I would say, like pregnant with something that could grow into character, maybe, which is his big, Hillman's big focus, is that everything we're experiencing to some degree, the therapy or whatever, is in building and becoming the character that we are, as opposed to managing symptoms or trying to feel good or trying to feel at peace or whatever. It's, the whole point is shaping or structuring, character. Yeah.
Yeah, it sounds much more expansive as opposed to the contraction of the traditional psychology.
Mm-hmm.
Am I getting that?
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. That's really cool. Like I never considered the archetypes to be like something in the body. It's always been sort of like a mental construct, I guess. So
Mm-hmm.
just that idea is really intriguing to me.
Yeah.
It's giving me a lot to chew on.
Yeah, I like the idea that we know and live with all the archetypes, and like the archetypal analysis or all this kind of stuff just brings our awareness to when we're inhabiting in the body. Like, I think dancers are people that know the archetypes probably the best, because they, I mean, from a lot of people, like even Marion Woodman's work was all, originally she was based in dance before psychology, and she has a lot of writing about looking at certain dancers and being like, who are they embodying? So like drama and dance, there's this instinctual movement that comes out of us, and she's like, well, who's that character that's coming out of you? And that is why I really like contact improv as a practice. It's like a improvisational dance with other people that's very, it's not a lot of structure to it. I've noticed that the characters or those archetypes just naturally come out, and it's so trippy to watch it happen. And you almost like fall into it. So I think that Yeah, I think myth and story and archetype, I think in the true sense, is is an instinctual sensory experience. And that's, I think, the somatic and the Jungian really meet um, organically, I think.
Yeah. So do you think that embodiment is exploring those different archetypes and then like just sort of feeling into like where your energy feels the most grounded and the most sort of secure, and then just kind of like braiding in those different elements as they come up? Because like I really like that idea of like all the archetypes being there, and then what comes up to me is that we have more or less access to different archetypes based on our experience and based on, you know, like maybe how we grew up and what we feel comfortable exploring. But then just sort of like, how do we continue to sort of explore that?
Hmm. I really love that question. I'll take a stab at it. I think, I mean, I'm sure I'm definitely not an embodiment expert, but I can say that I think it's a practice of getting building capacity, the capacity to tolerate ambiguity, because our ego is a character, right? So that character can have different types of different archetypes within it, but that character to some degree has boundaries or edges or rigidity to it, right? It's got a structure.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So if we want to let in other characters or other feelings or experiences or qualities of self, we have to be able to have a relationship to ambiguity and things we don't know or understand. So I think a lot of times we're, especially in our culture, we're like, always want to know and always trying to figure it out, right? Science is like, that's the ethos, right? Where
Right.
I find embodiment is so much more a practice of curious ambiguity, right? So if I'm practicing being curious about something that's unknown or even having a relationship to mystery, period, or I should put it like this. If I don't have a relationship to ambiguity and I'm very invested in my character, number one, I might not even notice that I'm having a somatic experience of um, maybe attraction or like a new desire. And that might like be totally unconscious. It might come in and my body might just, I might not even notice it all because I'm so invested in my character that I'm not even noticing it. The other element of it is like there might be a growing hostility towards the unknown, which I find can be true in a lot of folks, you know? So I think the place to start is to notice your relationship to the unknown and to ambiguity, because I think that is your relationship to the soul. That is your relationship to a lot of what's going on in the body. And I think that's what can really create this expansive process of embodying qualities that might be way out of the realm of the character that we've developed, that might be a prison, you know, to some degree.
Wow. So then to kind of continue that thought, would you agree that maybe that's a reason that people need integration support, is like that sometimes working with these medicines can blow that ambiguity, like sort of blow you through it, you know, like
Yeah.
if you're walking along the trail and all of a sudden this psychedelic experience like warps you into completely new territory or a completely different wing of the mansion that you know didn't even know was there,
Right.
or you knew it was there and you've purposefully stayed away from
That's
it
right.
your entire life, and now what do you do with that experience?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, totally. I think you're right on, because I think a lot of times, especially with like, I work for a retreat center that serves 5-MeO, and that's a great version of that story that you're telling, which is like 5-MeO is like a vertical axis
Right.
and human life is a horizontal. And then I think the biggest thing people are like, well, what the hell was that? That feels like light years away from my existence right here. What do I even make of, that experience, right?
Right.
So yeah, I do think that that's, yeah, the necessity of integration, I think, is, maybe to put it simply, is that the growing dissociation between that reality and the reality you're living is kind of a psychosis to a degree. To have an experience blow you out into the ether, maybe the edges of consciousness, and then to come back and have such a rigid character. There's this book I really love by Ettinger. It's called Ego and Archetype. And he talks about how, like, the small self and the big self, or you could say like the personal me and like the collective humanity, or just being period life, have a relationship, and they're maybe constantly talking to each other. And Jungians believe that that relationship is largely happening unconsciously through dreams and those types of processes. But yeah, the notion is that that place that you went to in your psychedelic experience and where you are today, there's a relationship there. And integration, I think, is the true recognition and engagement with the fact that these two things are related, and they're maybe even relating to each other all the time. And if they feel totally alien to each other, that will create, yeah, a problem. That will create quite a bit of disarray, usually in the psyche and dreams and day-to-day life, maybe a growing sense of anxiety that wasn't there prior. So yeah, I think the necessity there to bridge that, for there to be a connection between those two worlds, I think is, yeah, quite natural and necessary.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, and thanks for bringing it up. We started to touch on it before we hit record. You asked me, like, how did I get into this world and the work that I'm doing, and even though I didn't mention it explicitly, a 5-MeO experience like was a very large gateway that I went through that sort of opened up into this mansion, let's say, just to
Yeah.
keep the metaphor going. And it was sort of like learning about this whole new world, like going from, well, I've eaten a fair amount of acid and mushrooms and stuff in high school and after high school, but I didn't know what integration was. I didn't know about, having somebody hold space for you or having a sitter. And, even that first 5-MeO experience, like, is still something that it continues to grow. And like, I feel like I'm still unpacking it,
Totally.
like, 4.5 years later.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like the more time goes on, the more I'm appreciating that it's still unfolding, and like just understanding it in different dimensions, and appreciating like the places that it's continued to sort of open up inside of me. So I'm really grateful that you brought up the 5-MeO, because just, full transparency for the audience, like that was my initial curiosity with talking with Otto was, meeting him at the MAPS conference in Denver a few months ago. And, I was speaking with Joel, who is one of the people that runs the retreat center that Otto works at. And I was like, trying to give him my elevator pitch about like what the podcast is about. And he was like, "Oh, it's about integration. Well, you need to talk to Otto. He does all our integration. You really should talk with him." And I was like, "Okay, cool." And yeah, just kind of took off from there of like my curiosity of like, oh yeah, this is definitely someone that I would love to chat with on the podcast. So how did you get involved with Tandava?
Well, I'll start with how I got involved with 5, because
Okay.
I love what you said.
Perfect.
I think 5, the immensity of that experience cannot be understated. It really can't. Like you said, 4 years later, yeah, I believe you all day. It's not
right.
Not to, put medicines in hierarchies. Personally, ayahuasca is like my heart and soul. As far as immensity though, 5 is do not play with 5. Ladies and gentlemen, like that is an experience that can leave an impression on you for a lifetime, for sure. No doubt about that. And for me, my first 5-MeO experience, I was very sensitive. I had done a month-long plant dieta in the Amazon, and then I was 2 months out. It was like quite a bit. I was landed, but I was still very sensitive. And I was served by someone who overdosed me tremendously. So gave me twice the normal dose of the strongest molecule that you can take. And that left a traumatic imprint on my nervous system, essentially, that actually got me into integration. So the work that I do, I was interested in it for sure, but I didn't have a necessity or a passion or a like soul for it until I got to a place where I needed integration and no one could help me. Everyone I was talking to, they didn't, 5 wasn't this thing that was very popular at the time. And I was trying to explain to people the type of experience that I had, and they were like, yeah, sounds crazy, but like I can't, I don't really know what you're talking about, or I don't really know how to help you unpack that. And so it began this obsessive trying to help myself through what I experienced, and reading tons of Tibetan literature, yogic philosophy, somatic experiencing, doing all sorts of stuff. And unbeknownst to me, cultivated this tremendous toolbox for metabolizing that experience. And luckily, I got to work with it again and again in a safe way, the right doses, small steps up a ladder of small dose, handshake, hug, full release type situation. And so while I was doing that work, I worked for an integration school that was teaching. It was like a certification course for psychedelic integration coaching. And I was one of the teachers. I had met Victoria. She was one of the students. And then Victoria and Joelle, when they started Tandava, Victoria and I had great rapport and worked together for like over a year or so. So then they like were curious about the work I did. And then, so I was happy I got to get in on Tandava when they first started. And the thing that attracted me to working with Joelle and Victoria is that they have a retreat model in terms of integration that is unlike anything I've ever experienced, which is that if you're sitting for 5, you're sitting in the retreat, part of the package of what you're paying for is preparation and integration. So it's not an option. They don't make it an option, where every other retreat is this optional thing that you can do, which I think unconsciously is saying something like, you have a choice to do this. We value it,
Right.
but not everyone needs it, right? Where Tandava says, no, you're sitting with 5-MeO, you need this, period. So then people don't question it. And it's so next level to have that. I can't tell you how many people I work with who, two things. One, they either at the end, they get at least a month. So we get 4 sessions. I either hear, wow, I didn't even know what integration was or that I needed it, but thank God that I did this, because I absolutely needed it. And I definitely wouldn't have done it if it wasn't, provided for me. And they continue to do the integration work one-on-one for months afterwards, right? So that was how I got into working with Tandava, and why I continue to love to devote so much time and energy to the project, is because I think that is something that is unique in the space, that is, especially with 5, and I'll venture to say ayahuasca as well, is something that's, I think, should be non-negotiable. I think it should be something that's, don't just tell people you value integration. Be like, if you come here, this is part of the ritual that we offer,
Yeah. Creating that culture.
Right.
Right. It's like it, I mean, we see that, I guess, in our Western society in terms of businesses, right? Like, you walk into work at a certain company and they're like, this is our culture, this is what we do. And you learn sometimes by observing other people in that, and sometimes it's explicit. No, these are our values, this is what we do. And even when you're like, I've been in situations where, like, okay, I'm looking around, everybody else is doing this, well, this is what I'm supposed to do, this is what I should be doing too. So what a wonderful model and environment to foster, within not only medicine work in general, but like you mentioned, such a powerful medicine,
right?
When we're talking about 5.
Especially
Great.
with 5. I like that you brought that in too, because it's cultural. Create a culture around it. So
Right.
I want to make it easy for people to want to do integration. I don't want to have to sell it,
Yes.
It should make, I'm not going to sell it, you know what I mean?
Right. And I've said this before many times, and I'm going to guess that you'd agree, but I'm curious. It's, as an integration coach, it's so much easier, and I'm always so much happier when somebody's coming to me and they're saying, I'm interested in sitting with whatever it is, rather than they're coming to me afterwards going, I opened Pandora's box and now I don't know what to do with what came out.
That's right.
Right? Like, it's so much easier, and I would so much prefer working with somebody from that preparation stage, and I always say, integration starts with preparation. Don't wait until after you had this experience and now you're holding on to it as you're trying to integrate and not disintegrate
Right.
the world around you.
That's
right?
Yeah. I definitely, I mean, I'm a huge proponent of, you want to have a smooth experience. You want to really get the most out of this experience, and you want it to stick. You gotta prepare. And part of preparation is screening. It's knowing, avoiding the pitfalls of probably sitting with the wrong facilitator. It's, so much. I feel like set and setting has lost all of its meaning. It's what is set? That's your psyche. That's a large box to open. It's not just an intention, right? So there's all this stuff to get into. I will say, admittedly, I also love the chaos of like people coming to me and they're being like, I am like having an emergency. And like there's part of me
Right.
that's like there's some like chaos there that I enjoy helping people like. So I think that's maybe why I love the work that I do, because I'm sure I think more people probably call me, and I'm curious for you. Way more people in my inbox from my website are like, I'm falling apart. I
Right.
need some help.
For
Right.
sure.
That's like 80-20. You know what I mean? Like, so,
Yeah.
um, which I think for a while I was like, man, people like integration, do the prep, all this kind of stuff. And now I'm like, this is cool. All right. Like,
Yeah.
I've kind of like come to a place where now I'm like, I'm kind of appreciative of the fact that it's very hard to change. I struggle to
Sure.
change all the time.
Right.
It's hard. We are like rooted in our patterns and our habits and all this stuff. It is really quite a changing is hard.
Yeah.
What
Right.
I love about psychedelics is like psychedelics are like, you want to change, you're changing. And
Yeah.
as part of that chaos when people come and they're like, I'm a mess afterwards, is like, I find it's like your old way of being that has now left. And
Yeah.
now we have to change. And
Yeah.
so the one part of it is like it sucks because probably you're super dysregulated, and this is harder than it has to be because we didn't do the prep and all this stuff, and maybe there's a little bit of like backtracking that has to be done and all sorts of stuff to create safety. And the benefit is that your old coping mechanisms don't work anymore. What a
Right.
gift.
Yeah.
What a gift, it's like you pushed yourself off into the deep end, and there is a wisdom to the part of you that was like, you know what, you're probably not going to change unless we do this. So I think like
Yeah.
that is something I do really appreciate about that whole dynamic, is that I will say the folks who go through that process, if they engage in the integration, they get the help they need, it always ends with tremendous impact in their lives.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. There's definitely beauty in the breakdown and that situation. And, to relate to you and, my own experience, it's like both of what we've shared, right? Like we weren't doing preparation before those experiences, like necessarily. And so, yeah, so that I think what you're speaking to is like that transmutation of all that chaos into something that's a little bit more ordered or a little bit more embodied, and like where that leads. And that's definitely a beautiful thing.
Yeah,
You know, uh, it sounds like your experience led you into the work that you're doing. My experience led me into the work that I'm doing. Um, so that's that transmutation. And there is that, like what came up for me as you were describing sort of that, that free fall is like the tower energy,
yeah,
from tarot. The lightning has struck, you are in free fall.
totally.
You're probably freaking out a little bit because like lightning just struck the tower, and it's really really scary, and yet there's a beauty in the fact that you can't go back. There's a beauty in that free fall and like embracing it, and like not having the option of sort of contracting or surrendering like back into the familiar and the known.
Totally.
And like where that leads to is can be a really really incredibly beautiful space.
I think it's the most important journey we can take as human beings, to be honest, is like the, I would call it the initiatory rite of passage that will happen again and again in our lives. It's not a one and done, which I was upset to find out about. Is that like it's not, you don't just go through one initiation then you're like, I did it. But
Right.
many, seasons of life but it's maybe to your point about like prep is like Joseph Campbell talks about the difference between like kind of falling from the tower versus choosing to dive, right? Like I think the idea of these really intense initiatory rites, like you could say like the archetypes of those initiatory rites, like Sundance, for example, is like, I love using that example because you have a kid, a child who's like, you know, going into manhood, and like the initiatory experience of that is being taken from the comfort of home and mother to be initiated with the men via pain. You know, you're scarring the chest. They're putting these hooks in the chest and like ripping, you know, the skin. So there's like the idea is that like you're being initiated through an experience of pain and sacrifice into a bigger dimension of life. So I think that the wisdom of that ritual is that you're choosing, you're making a choice, there's agency, you're taking on that experience, and it prepares you for life, and it expands your sense of who you are and your relationship to the world to choose to go into that painful experience. And I think where psychedelics kind of sometimes get tricky is that they will do that organically. You know, psychedelics can initiate an initiatory experience. And if you're not ready for it, if you didn't say yes to it, the medicine doesn't really care, right? So like you can be, you know, neck deep in an initiatory experience, and if you're not choosing to say yes to it, it's too much too fast too soon. That's trauma that gets registered in the nervous system as trauma. And I can't tell you how many people I talk to on a regular basis who that was the case. You know, they came to a medicine because they were saying, you know, I have anxiety, and I've heard that psychedelics can really help with anxiety. And they, you know, all of that true, absolutely. And then they were given this experience that was much bigger than they had asked for, and they didn't have the prep to really wrestle with and encounter how they actually felt about that invitation. And so they just got pushed into the deep end. And sometimes there's a lot of backtracking, trauma processing. I think sometimes that has to happen because that choice wasn't made. You know, they didn't really know what they were getting themselves into. And I think that might be kind of the biggest, I'm kind of going on a rant here, but maybe the biggest danger with psychedelics being touted as therapeutic medicines. You know, I feel that they are much more agents of revelation than they are agents of healing specifically. They totally have a healing quality to them immensely, but fundamentally they reveal. They are agents of revelation. So I think that those two approaches can be very different, because if someone is coming to an experience for anxiety and they're given a religious or a spiritual experience, those are very different. You know, can be much more than one bargains for.
Yeah. And like you said earlier, you know, that this other aspect that I don't think is getting talked enough in the space, which is when trauma occurs during the medicine experience, and like, what do we do with that? And I felt a lot of empathy and understanding because I've been through my own trauma that occurred during the medicine. But like, just, you know, like you were talking about, you know, going and talking to people and trying to have somebody understand you. And it's like people just don't know what to do with that.
Yeah.
You know, it's like, and even, you know, if you like if you Google like trauma and psychedelics, you're not going to find anything that addresses the trauma that can occur within the medicine experience. It's like, no, people are coming to psychedelics because of their trauma, you know, like
Yeah, that's right.
everything that you're going to find is around that. Um, and yet they're looking back on it, you know, for me, and I would assume you as well, is like, oh, that experience like led me into a bigger world. It led me into, you know, something that I'm passionate about. It, you know, kind of gave me that direction and understanding of like, oh, well, this is trauma's no joke,
Right.
you know, and wow, like how can I support people that are going through this very overwhelming experience?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I love doing that work because I I feel that if you go through that initiatory, it is traumatic, right? You, like even the Sundance example, like you're creating a physical trauma. You're creating an opening, and that
Mm.
opening is an opening into, like you said, a bigger life, a bigger character, a larger sense of self, and to who we were. It's trauma, right? It's like
Right.
there's a death that's happening. So I think that that is natural. I think that's why these rituals are archetypal amongst like all these different cultures. They're like a reflection of nature, of a process, a natural process. And of course, these earth medicines initiate this natural process. Who knew? Right. So I think it's super helpful. What I've noticed is that sometimes the therapeutic language doesn't really create a big enough container to hold the, I would say, these experiences in terms of integration have expanded my personal cosmology, my relationship to the much bigger questions and context of my life. And in order to like articulate that cosmology or put a name and a face to something I had experienced that was traumatic, I needed bigger stories, bigger stories that so many other cultures offered, like Tibetan Buddhism, for example, helped me a lot with my 5-MeO experience, where if I just stuck with the therapeutic language of trauma, I don't think it would have allowed me to expand into that greater cosmology. And I'm always, I think, as a integration guide, I'm always looking for that doorway between the experience of this being like an experience of like contracting and tightening into smallness and trauma, or the empowerment of a greater character and a greater like orientation, you know, that cosmology that really can hold the experience, you know.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. It's really interesting that you kind of related the Tibetan Buddhism to the 5-MeO experience. That was exactly my takeaway, and a conversation that I've had with other, you know, 5 practitioners, and even the person that held space for that first experience. Like that was my only frame of reference, was like, wow, this is like the experience of death in the Tibetan Book of the Dead and of the clear light. And what I walked away from that initially with, and it's still kind of, you know, you mentioned like the hierarchies of medicine. And um, I still think that one of the most beautiful blessings about 5 is that it gives us this experience of like what I would imagine death and letting go truly is. And if if the Tibetans are correct, and so much of millennia in the future for ourselves depends on this dying experience, and we only get one chance at it if without psychedelics, right? We've got this one chance to get it right, and that's one of the reasons that maybe it's taken countless eons of rebirths to like get to where we are right now. What a blessing to have these opportunities to practice.
Dude, what a blessing.
It's incredible.
What an opportunity to like, right. And yeah, I think the Tibetan Book of the Dead, that and Aldous Huxley for me gave me a geography that I was like, finally, like that. Okay, now I feel like I can see the territory of what I experienced a little bit in a way that was so meaningful, right? And it's it's huge. The Tibetan cosmology is huge to consider, like, eons of rebirth and this one focused moment of death being like the moment, you know. And it's like,
right,
culturally, I think just a side story. When I left one of my first dietas, I asked my Shipibo teacher, like, how do I integrate? And he like laughed at me, and he was like, I don't know, man. Essentially, he's like, you got to go back to New York. Like, not me. I live here in the jungle, and like, this is a part of my culture and my life, you know, and all this stuff. So in terms of like stories, you know, I think we're in this interesting period in time where I think to a large extent we've lost the religious images that once held us, you know, the Christian myths. And we have this new substance, these substances that are bringing us this direct experience, but our cultural stories can't really hold them yet, right? We're in this like limbo in between figuring it out place. And yeah, I think the Tibetan stories, the myths, that was the first time that I finally had a container that I could pour the experience into. And like, that's what settled my nervous system. That's what helped me start to be able to actually metabolize, was the right story, you know, the right cosmology. And I think that's, to bring it back with archetypes, I think that's why stories are somatic. I think that's where integration and SE meets, you know, the spirit kind of like story myth place.
It's just bringing up so much for me, and I really appreciate that you're sort of bringing this idea and this view forward. You know, for me, when Buddhist sort of things started to show up in my medicine work, it made sense. It was like, okay, well, you've been studying and practicing, you know, this for like 20 years. Like, of course, there would be things in your subconscious or like ways that you're processing and filtering and seeing these experiences through these lenses. But when other archetypal and mythological forces started to come in without me understanding or knowing about them, that was where that expanded cosmology started to happen for me. And that to me has been like one of the most astounding and amazing things. And now that we're talking about it, it's like, oh yeah, this is somatic for me.
Totally.
Because just to share, you know, like what started to happen from the first ayahuasca ceremony was there was this figure. There was like this sort of, the way that I experienced him the first time was like this warrior, and he was wearing this like loincloth, and he had like this spear, but he was like very powerful and protective. And he started to show up repeatedly in these ayahuasca experiences. And I would go and I would talk with my SE practitioner, and I was exploring it a little bit because I'm like, what is this? Where is this coming from? We got to this point where, we would be doing some work and she would say, is there somebody that you can bring in to support you during this? And without even thinking, immediately I started going towards this figure. And like I would be able to bring this figure in, and and he would support me, and so I always just thought, okay, this is like a part of my higher self, right, that I'm connecting with in the medicine space, and like what an amazing thing that I'm able to resource myself with this. Well, there was a night where I was there was a night where I had gone out. I was in LA, and I was at a club, and I had taken some MDMA, and I went back to the place I was staying, and I was listening to this song by this artist named Manish Damore, and there's this like mantra in the song. And I don't know if I was just like open from the MDMA, but like there was something that was like connecting. Like I was feeling this opening, listening to this mantra. And I'm like, I gotta know, like, and I like picked up my phone and I like Googled what this mantra was. And literally the first thing that came up was this image of this avatar that had been showing up in my medicine work as this avatar of Shiva. And it was so amazing to me because up until that point, like the only Shiva that I knew was the Nataraja, like the dancing Shiva. Mm-hmm. But in this moment, there was just, everything just completely fell away. I was just sitting there weeping and just like filled with just this immense gratitude and joy and just wonder of like, what the heck just happened? That like here I'm looking at my phone and this is the exact image that I've never seen before, at least consciously,
right,
but has been showing up in my unconscious.
Exactly.
And that relationship has continued to grow and to get stronger and to get much more transpersonal and direct. And that to me is really magical because I never was interested in Shiva before, right. Like it was all like Buddhist, like, okay, Buddha some sort of deity shows up like in the ayahuasca space. That makes sense to me. Like there's something in my subconscious, but here's this whole other like energetic force. Wow. This is amazing.
Yeah. That just gave me chills because like, that's integration. That like exactly what you just said is like, it doesn't have to be this boring practice journal, It's like, it's so much more alive and somatic. And it's like, dude, yeah, you had this unconscious driven experience of this quality or this archetype wanted to make its way into your experience, like wanted to make its way into your life in some way. And slowly you became more and more open to that. And I love you tracking the kind of like, this wasn't just an intellectual, we didn't literalize the deity and be like,
no.
I see people do that all the time where like they make like folks who are really new age spiritual, they'll be like, Shiva literally came to me, the one Shiva, and which we can argue about that all day, whether that's literally true or not, who cares? I'm more interested in the fact that like, you had a felt experience of an archetype affecting your emotional body, your perception, all this kind of stuff. And I'm sure it changed you, right? So like, that's the ego archetype. That's the relationship to ambiguity. That's like all the stuff we talked about. I feel like you just encapsulated it into a story and an experience. That is really, I think like the power of integration is exactly what you're talking about, is these like cool, mystic, transpersonal experiences that are deeply felt in the body.
Yeah. And to tie it into, thank you for saying that. And I think what ties it in even further to what we've been discussing is like that those experiences, and there's more that I could go into, but we don't have quite the time for this episode. But like, those experiences didn't just leave me with like, oh, I have this resource and I can call upon it and like use it to support me. In a lot of ways, it opened completely new wings of the mansion and like kind of left me like going, what the hell do I do with this? Like, what am I supposed to do now? Am I supposed to like move to an ashram and just do this for the rest of my life? Like, what am I supposed to do with this experience? And so it added new layers and dimensions and richness to my life, and continues to do so.
I think that's the, like, if I could just plug our service, it's like, I think that's the value of having an integration guide, is someone who can help you make sense of, all right, well, now all these like new wings of the mansion are available. What do I do with this? Do I go live in an ashram, or like, how can I, what is this actually calling for in my life, and how does it create balance with the life that I already have? And, to be able to like integrate it in a balanced, healthy way that's actually like moving us forward in an authentic way, I think is, it's so valuable to have with these experiences. It's so valuable.
Hey, I really hope you enjoyed this episode as much as I did. If you didn't already, go ahead and leave a review on whatever platform you are listening or watching the podcast on. I truly appreciate your support. Also, make sure that you sign up for my newsletter at bluemagicalchemy.com to be the first to get updates, exclusive content, and insights delivered straight to your inbox. This is another fantastic way to stay connected and keep the journey going. And when you sign up, I'll send you a free guide to using breathwork for integration as a way to show my gratitude for your support. If you are eager to dive a little bit deeper as far as transformation, integration, coaching, breathwork, or meditation, feel free to reach out to me through my website, bluemagicalchemy.com, or bluemagicalchemy@gmail.com to connect, set up a free discovery call, and talk about how I can support you in your work. Remember that it's not about the method you choose or the pace at which you travel. The vital point is to consistently show up for yourself and practice. As the saying goes, it's not the destination, but the journey that truly matters. And I am honored to be a part of yours. Please don't hesitate to reach out, connect, share your journey, the successes and the challenges alike. I'm just an email, DM, or review away. Thanks again for tuning in, and until our next episode, keep exploring, keep growing, and above all, keep practicing, because that's the vital point.